So before we start, here's a quick introduction of our speaker today. We have with us Mr. John Lair, who is the Senior Engineer for Product Certification. John has 30 years of experience in the testing and certification industry and 12 years of experience working for a manufacturer's compliance group. As a R&D Senior Technical Certifier, John brings extensive knowledge on the R&D topic. So with that, I will now hand the presentation over to John, who will kick off with an introduction to the topic.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. If I had to offer one piece of advice, it would be to read the Radio Equipment Directive. However, as this is not the most interesting document to read, this webinar will cover the fundamentals for you. The later sections of the webinar support manufacturers with technical documentation changes, including risk assessments, information on notified bodies, and finally some of the current issues with harmonized standards developments. To cover all the sections of this webinar in detail would take a day, but we have less than 1 hour. For this reason, the webinar points at references where to find more details in the directive and other documents, and specifically highlights important changes. So let's begin. This first section is a short view of some of the key fundamentals of the Radio Equipment Directive. This will be a reminder to some people online, but will cover the basics for people who are new to this directive. The Radio Equipment Directive, or RED, or RED, was agreed the 16th of April 2014 and came into effect the 13th of June 2016. The Radio Equipment Directive replaces the Radio Equipment and Telecommunications Terminal Equipment Directive, or R&TTE Directive for short, which ceases to be valid from the 13th of June 2017. This is probably why most people will be listening to this webinar. The scope of the RED is different to the R&TTE Directive. The key difference between the two directives is that broadcast receivers, which were exempt from the R&TTE Directive, fall under the scope of the RED. Also, the frequency range of the RED is now anything below 3000 GHz. The R&TTE Directive started at 9 kHz. The RED includes all radio equipment which intentionally emit and/or receives radio waves for radio determination or radio communication. A popular misconception with the R&TTE Directive was that it excluded receivers. This is not correct. Receivers, including, for example, GPS receivers and radio determination equipment such as radar, were already under the scope of the R&TTE Directive. The RED clarifies the definitions of what is radio equipment. Line telecoms equipment, such as PSTN telephones, fall outside of the scope of the RED, as they are not radio equipment. Likewise, a microwave oven, not being radio communications or radio determination equipment, falls outside the scope of the RED, as it did for the R&TTE Directive. Hopefully, this slide, courtesy of the Draft Radio Equipment Directive Guide, and the timelines are not a shock to most people viewing this webinar. The two bottom timelines show that the old electromagnetic compatibility and low voltage directives were replaced by the new directives in April 2016 with no transition period. In contrast, the timelines at the top show radio equipment have had a 1-year transition period to comply with the RED, starting in June 2016, which will finish June 2017, when the R&TTE Directive ceases to be valid. So let's put these timelines into perspective for the various product types. If you look at the top timelines for radio equipment, and by radio equipment I mean all radio equipment currently falling under the scope of the R&TTE Directive, you can see that during the period of the 13th of June 2016 until the 12th of June 2017, you can currently use either the R&TTE Directive or the RED. From the 13th of June 2017 onwards, only the RED can be used. Likewise, on the middle timelines, equipment that was not in the R&TTE directive but will be in the RED, i.e. broadcast receivers and equipment operating below 9 kHz, can currently use either the EMC directive and low voltage directives together or the RED. In the same way, from the 13th of June 2017, these product types can only have compliance to the RED. And finally, the bottom timeline shows that line telecoms equipment has to already comply with the EMC directive and low voltage directive combined, as the transition period was for the RED applicable radio equipment. As with the R&TTE directive, compliance is with a set of essential requirements. These are Article 3.1a for health and safety, but the RED also includes domestic animals and the protection of property. Then there's Article 3.1b for electromagnetic compatibility, EMC, Article 3.2 for radio and RF, but the RED also includes the efficient use of the radio spectrum, which, as you will see later, is an important change. And finally, there's Article 3.3. These are additional requirements when they are invoked. Under the RED, it requires a delegated act by the European Commission to invoke an Article 3.3 requirement. Although there are currently no delegated acts, the guidance is that the Commission decisions taken accordance to Article 3.3 of the R&TTE directive remain applicable under the RED to the extent that they are not incompatible with the RED. This next point is very important. Compliance is against essential requirements and not standards. However, compliance with appropriate harmonised standards published in the European Union Official Journal and used in full give automatic presumption of conformity with the appropriate essential requirements. Again, importantly, the essential requirements apply even in the absence of harmonised standards, which is sadly the case we have at the moment in several points. Because of these changes, new harmonised standards were required. Because of the scope of the RED is different, and there are differences to the R&TTE directive essential requirements, particularly for Article 3.2, which means there'll be additional requirements, for example, for receiver performance testing. The conformity assessment procedures are explained in Article 17 of the RED. These are the routes to be taken to compliance, which are Annex 2 is internal production control, where there is no notified body involvement. It's a self-declaration procedure. Annex 3 is an EU type examination and conformity to type based on internal production control. There is notified body involvement required to assess the technical documentation and compliance to the applicable parts of the RED. And finally, Annex 4 is full quality assurance. There is a notified body involvement to assess design, manufacturing, inspection, and test processes. Annex 3 and Annex 4 are explained in detail later in this presentation. Importantly, all the conformity procedures require compliance to the applicable parts of the RED and the essential requirements. So if we map the essential requirements to the available conformity assessment procedures, we get the following. If you look at the top left box of this slide, for Article 3.1a and Health and Safety and 3.1b EMC, you can use any of the conformity assessment procedures, either Annex 2, 3 or 4, and can self-declare even in the absence of safety and EMC specifications in the RED Official Journal. Similarly, if you look at the top middle box for Article 3.2 Radio and Article 3.3, when you're using harmonised standards, and by that I mean RED Official Journal published harmonised standards, in full, you can use Annex 2, 3 or 4. The top right box is for Article 3.2 radio and Article 3.3, where there are no harmonized standards, or you're partially using harmonized standards, or you're using draft standards, etc. In which case, the only routes to compliance are Annex 3 or Annex 4, which require a notified body. Important terminology in the RED is the concepts of placing on the market, which includes first making available on the market. There is also the concept of putting into service, which means the first use of the radio equipment in the Union by its end user. Each individual radio equipment made available on the market must comply with the RED at the moment of placing on the market. From the 13th of June 2017 onwards, all radio equipment must be compliant with the RED and may no longer be placed on the market using the R&TTE directive. To explain this further, an R&TTE compliant product already with a distributor, for example, it's already in the retail outlet or in the supply chain, can still be sold on to the end user after the 13th of June 2017, as it is not under the control of the manufacturer or importer and has already been placed on the market. However, further individual items of this same R&TTE compliant product cannot be placed onto the market after the 13th of June 2017. The RED has the concept of economic operators, which have specific obligations. For manufacturers, which can be both inside and outside of Europe, Article 10 should be referenced. There can be an authorised representative when appointed by a manufacturer. They have to be in Europe, and their obligations can be found in Article 11. For an importer who has to be in Europe, they should be referencing Article 12, and for a distributor who has to be in Europe, obviously, they should be referencing Article 13. All economic operators have specific obligations for market surveillance authorities. This was an important change to the new framework directives. These RED articles 10 to 13, listed there on the slide, map to the Blue Guide sections 3.1, 3.2, 3.3 and 3.4. As an example, a distributor should be referencing RED Article 13 and Blue Guide Section 3.4, where the requirements are they verify the product is correctly CE marked, accompanied by relevant documents, for example, and they have the declaration of conformity, etc. This is on combined equipment. The presence of an inbuilt radio or component in a piece of non-radio equipment makes the whole product radio equipment. Combined equipment is radio equipment for the RED. There is an ETSI guide, EG 203367, providing guidance for multi-radio and combined radio and non-radio equipment. The Blue Guide on the implementation of EU product rules 2016, which has now also been listed in the European Union Official Journal, is a fundamental supporting document. The majority of questions about placing a radio product on the market can be answered by referencing the RED and Blue Guide in combination. A further document is the RED Guide, which is yet to be published. It's currently in draft format. This will provide additional support for economic operators and notified bodies to be used in conjunction with the RED and Blue Guide. It will include additional guidance on, for example, combined equipment, fixed installations and infrared devices. There's a long list of items covered by the RED Guide, providing additional guidance. The third section of this webinar is to provide some guidance to manufacturers on the R&D technical documentation requirements and the requirement for a risk analysis and an assessment. Technical documentation requirements are similar for Annex 2, 3 and 4 of the RED. That is, a compiled set of technical documentation and a technical justifications for compliance with the essential requirements of the RED. The technical documentation fundamentals are explained in RED Article 21 and Annex 5. Those are the two main references you need, but noting the directive itself and the framework requirements also require additional documentation, for example, the risk assessment. The technical documentation requirements are similar to the R&TTE Directive technical construction file requirements. That's a change in the terminology between the two directives. R&TTE and the old directives used to call it technical construction file. It's now called technical documentation. But specific differences to consider include what the intended purpose is for the product for all the essential requirements, what the reasonably foreseeable use is for the product for Article 3.1a, health and safety, a risk analysis and assessment, which is strategically linked to the compliance strategy of the product and will end up with what harmonized standards are required, as I will show in a moment. There are changes to the user information requirements to consider. There are changes to the labeling requirements to consider. There are changes to the declaration of conformity format to consider. Additionally, you need to consider compliance to Article 10.2, that the product can be operated in at least one member state, and Article 10.10, when the product has restrictions on putting into service in one of the member states. There are additional requirements for packaging and the user guide. A RED risk analysis and assessment is a fundamental to the RED technical documentation and compliance strategy of the product, as well as fundamental aspect of all the new directives. Risk does not just relate to health and safety for the RED. Obviously, if people that are used to the risk assessment for the low voltage directive, they would have been only covering safety. For the RED, you need to cover all the essential requirements for the intended use of the product, and in addition, for Article 3.1a, for the reasonably foreseeable use. Although I've tried to avoid listing large sections of text, the blue guide is the main starting reference for a risk assessment and has the text. In risk-related harmonized standard legislation, this means in particular that a manufacturer always, even when using harmonized standards, remains fully responsible for assessing all the risks of his product in order to determine which essential or other requirements are applicable. In other words, the manufacturer is always responsible for a risk assessment. This diagram, courtesy of the blue guide again, shows the concept of a risk assessment. The manufacturer performs a risk assessment to identify which of the essential requirements are applicable to their product. The manufacturer then applies either harmonized standards, which gives a presumption of conformity, or other standards as required, which have no presumption of conformity. The risk assessment documents how the risks are addressed, or otherwise known as mitigated, to ensure that the product complies with the essential requirements. Clearly using specifications that are not listed in the RED official journal, for example drafts and alternative specifications, have additional risk as they do not give presumption of conformity, and this should be considered in the risk assessment. Finally, there are a number of publicly available documents to support manufacturers in the production of a risk assessment from the European Commission, ADCO and Senelec. As an example, Senelec Guide 32 can be used to help in compiling the risk analysis. User information has changed between the two directives. You need to consider the intended purpose, Obviously, you need instructions on how to use the equipment. That's common between them. But a difference in the RED is that you now need to consider a description of accessories and components, including software, to allow the equipment to operate as intended. A further difference is that for transmitting equipment, the user guide needs to include a list of frequency bands and the maximum RF power transmitted in those bands. As with all the directives, the product should be supplied with a declaration of conformity or a simplified declaration of conformity. If the simplified declaration of conformity is in the user guide, it must contain the exact internet address where the full text of the EU Declaration of Conformity can be found, as per Annex 7 of the RED. The user guide needs any compliance-related installation instructions, and it also, the new requirement for the RED, is that if there's any restrictions on putting into service, it needs to comply with the requirements in Article 10.10 or any other implementing acts that may be applicable to the product. Labelling has also changed between the directives. The manufacturer is still required to follow the CE marking requirements of Regulation 765/2008. The notified body number after the CE mark is now only applied to products following the Annex 4 FQA route to compliance. If you look at the majority of mobile phones, they will still have a notified body number after this. Mobile phones, unless they're using Annex 4 FQA route to compliance, will no longer require the notified body number after the CE mark. The Class 2 identifier alert sign, that's the exclamation mark after the CE mark required by the R&TTE directive, is not required by the RED and is replaced by the requirements in accordance with Article 10.10 of the RED. The label should include a type, batch or serial number or other element allowing its identification. That's the wording from the directive. This is a big change. The label needs to have the manufacturer's name and registered trade name or registered trademark and the postal address at which they can be contacted. A big change in the directives is there's traceability required. However, there is an additional note on the postal address where the size or nature of the radio equipment does not allow it on its packaging or in the document accompanying the radio equipment. So clearly, if the product is physically very small, like a USB dongle, the postal address would be unreadable on it, then it wouldn't be sensible to have it on there. Electronic marking, this is e-marking or on-screen marking, is currently not allowed for the radio equipment directive. If you look at Recital 47 and Article 47, this will be reviewed again when the directive itself is reviewed in June 2018. The RED Declaration of Conformity requirements in Annex 6 are similar to an R&TTE Declaration of Conformity, for example, explaining the product type, manufacturer's address, compliance statement, signed and dated, etc., but has specific additional items to consider. You need to think about the specifications in particular. Historically, there was an argument that specification versions were not required for the R&TTE directive. The wording in the RED makes the listing of versions and dates of specifications and standards used for compliance as mandatory. You also need to list the notified body number if used, and exact explanation of how they were involved. Importantly, the EU Type Examination Certificate for Annex 3 has to be listed on the Declaration of Conformity. And finally, there is a change where applicable description of accessories and components, including software. So if the product is sold, for example, in the box with a charger, then this is expected to be on the Declaration of Conformity, particularly if it's impacting compliance with the RED. For RED Article 10.2 and 10.10, the RED manufacturer's obligations include the following, and due to the Annex 5 Item I wording, that's the reference at the bottom of this page, this explanation of compliance needs to be covered in the technical documentation. For Article 10.2, the manufacturer needs to confirm that the radio equipment has compliant operation in at least one member state, and for Article 10.10, where there are restrictions on use or requirements for authorization for use, information is required on the packaging to identify the member states where the restriction is. This packaging information must be fully explained in the user instructions. As an example, there is the common 5 GHz wireless LAN band, Wi-Fi band, which has a restriction for indoor use only. Note, there is a Commission implementing regulation being produced for guidance which is currently in draft format, which requires a specific pictogram on the packaging. Just to be clear, compliance to Article 10.10 is required regardless of the status of this implementing regulation. This next section is to explain what the notified body's obligations are and how the Annex 3 and Annex 4 conformity assessment procedures work. As already mentioned, Annex 3 Module B type examinations require the use of a notified body. The manufacturer submits an application to a single notified body of his choice. The notified body creates an evaluation report, the contents of which will only be released with the agreement of the manufacturer. There is a possibility that this could be requested by market surveillance authorities, but acceptance of this would have to come from the manufacturer. Where the type meets the requirement of the RED that apply to the radio equipment concerned, the notified body issues an EU type examination certificate to the manufacturer. And a note again, please note this is a type compliance of the product to the entire RED, not just, for example, the essential requirements. The manufacturer is required to inform the notified body of all modifications to the approved type that may affect the conformity of the radio equipment with the essential requirements of this directive, or the conditions for validity of that certificate. It's a key point that obviously if you've changed your product that could impact the compliance, or you've changed your product in a way that impacts how the certificate is valid, then the notified body needs to be informed. From a manufacturer's perspective, probably the most useful obligation of a notified body is that it needs to maintain knowledge of the state of the art and notify type examination certificate holders of changes which may affect the product's compliance with the RED. Realistically, this will be when the RED official journal is released. There are other requirements, 3 other requirements down there. They need to inform their notifying authority of the type examination certificates and whether if it's been withdrawn, etc. And they also need to inform other notified bodies of type examination certificates, including modifications which have been refused, withdrawn, suspended or restricted, and upon request, certificates including modifications it's issued. The RED Compliance Association is creating a database for this purpose. And finally, they need to inform member states of type examination certificates it's issued where you are not following OJ listed harmonized standards. That's the important point to remember. So if there is an available specification and you've used a notified body for Annex 3, but you've chosen to use another route to demonstrate compliance to the essential requirements, the notified body is obliged to inform all member states of this deviation. FQA approval is an approval of the manufacturer's process which permits the application of CE mark and notified bodies numbers to products within the scope of the FQA and RED. The manufacturer submits an FQA application to a single notified body of his choice, and the notified body assesses the quality system by periodic audits to determine whether it satisfies the requirements of the Annex 4 of the directive. Additionally, design audits, including assessment of product technical compliance documents, are verified as well. Quality systems based upon ISO 9000 and test facilities operating to ISO 17025 inherently meet many but not all of the requirements for an FQA approval under the directive. However, there needs to be consideration for the transitioning between ISO 9001 to 2008 to ISO 9001-2015 as well. People familiar with these two quality standards will understand why. Similarly, for Annex 4, notified body have specific obligations as well, and they need to inform their notifying authority of quality systems that have been approved, and also they need to inform other notified bodies of quality system approvals which have been refused, suspended, withdrawn, or upon request of quality system approvals which it has issued. Again, in these slides, at the bottom of the slides, you will see there's references that you can look at a later date. This final section explains the why and the how new harmonized standards are being generated by the standards organizations. Again, to cover all possible specifications in the time we have is not possible, but this section is to show some of the common specifications and some of the key updates. Finally, there are some general comments and pointers as to some of the critical things to consider as a manufacturer. The European Commission Implementing Decision Document M536 was a standards request to ETSI and Senelec to create RED harmonized standards for all the essential requirements. It included specific requests to the standards organizations to include an explanation of the relationship of the standard content to the essential requirements. There were new specifications, i.e. for broadcast receiver products required. And the majority of the R&TTE specifications are in the process or have been updated for the REG due to the changes in the essential requirements, particularly for Article 3.2, where the requirement is the efficient use of the radio spectrum. The European Commission review published specifications before citation in the RED Official Journal of Harmonized Standards. It's an important point. Issued standards may require further rework by the standards organization based on comments from the European Commission. There are currently no Article 3.1a health and safety harmonized standards listed in the RED Official Journal. However, some of the specifications are being updated. For example, the SAR RF exposure standards for head and body SAR, which are EN 50360 and EN 50566, are in the process of being updated. While we're on the subject of SAR, please remember that the Commission Implementing Decision 2016-537, dated the 5th of April 2016, this is the Commission Implementing Decision requesting a separation distance of not more than a few millimeters may be used, or otherwise known as the 5 millimeter body SAR separation requirement. Although this is for the R&TTE directive, you should be using this for RED products as well. Some safety specifications are also being updated for the RED, but are currently not in the RED official journal. For example, EN 62368 and EN 6950-22. There are currently no Article 3.1b specifications in the official journal. The majority of the EMC requirements can still be found under the R&TTE, EN 301489-1234 series of specifications, and they're in the process of being updated. However, there are Article 3.1b specifications outside of this EN 301489 range as well, and which are, as an example, EN 303446-1, which is for combined equipment for commercial and light industry locations, and EN 303446-2 for combined equipment in industrial locations. You also need to be aware that some of the Article 3.1b EMC specifications have been merged for the RED. For example, EN 301489-52 is a merge of the mobile phone R&TTE EMC specifications -7 and -24. Another important point, a key change is that radiator immunity testing is now required to 6 GHz. Under the R&TTE directive, radiated immunity testing was to 2.7 GHz. The series of specifications require immunity up to 6 GHz now. You also need to be aware that in some cases, depending on the technology, radiated immunity exclusion band ranges have also changed, particularly for the receiver band. In this particular case, the European Commission has recently made comments on a large number of the EN 301489-X series specifications, which are being reworked. A number of the Article 3.2 specifications are being created as a two-stage process. You need to be aware that there will be further revisions of a number of the specifications. This further revision will, for example, have additional receiver performance requirements. There are new Article 3.2 specifications for the RED, for example, for EN 303-340, EN 303-345, which was for broadcast receiver equipment. Also, some of the specifications have remained in the same number. For example, EN 300-328 for 2.4 GHz wideband transmission systems. This is for Bluetooth and wireless LAN. And this 300-328 is one of the two-stage process specifications, and this actual specification is in the OJ. EN 301893 for 5 gigs RLAN is another two-stage process specification, but it's currently not listed in the OJ. Additionally, some of the new product-specific specifications have been created for existing radio items under the scope of both the R&TTE directive and RED. For example, EN 303413 is for GNSS or global navigation systems. This includes, for example, GPS, GLONASS, and other products. EN 303417 is for wireless power transmission products. Again, these are only examples. We haven't got time to go through everything. The RED official journal is being harmonized standards is now being updated monthly. The next one is due around the 10th of April 2017. A number of the specifications may not be published in the RED official journal before the 13th of June. Unfortunately, this includes, for example, EN 303-345 for audio broadcast receivers, EN 301893 for 5 gigs RLAN devices, and EN 303413 for GNSS. You need to remember that the absence of harmonized standards does not mean do nothing. You still need to demonstrate compliance to the essential requirements, which for Article 3.2 will require notified body intervention. In the majority of cases, you cannot simply use existing In the majority of cases, you cannot simply use existing R&TTE specifications, as these are unlikely to cover the essential requirements of the RED, particularly for Article 3.2. The absence of harmonized standards may mean consideration for the use of ETSI Guide EG 203336 version 111 for Articles 3.1b and 3.2. Just to remember as a point on guides, with all guides, they are purely for compliance support and therefore cannot be referenced on declarations of conformity, for example, as they do not demonstrate compliance to the essential requirements. You also need to remember that they are only guides and always the wording of the RED prevails. If there are inconsistencies between the guidance and the RED is the important document. Some points. Draft and alternative specifications can be used to provide evidence of compliance, but this should be considered in the risk assessment as they do not provide presumption of conformity. But remember, if a manufacturer has decided to not use RED official journal published standards, the notified body involved needs to inform all the member states of this deviation. EMC and Low Voltage Directive OJ listed specifications do not provide presumption of conformity for the RED. This is also a specific difference between the R&TTE and RED official journal wording. If you look at the wording at the bottom of the R&TTE official journal, it's different to the RED official journal, where it's allowed. EMC and Low Voltage Directive OJ specifications can be used towards evidence of compliance, but this should be considered in the risk assessment. If available, I need to get this point across, if available, you should always try to use the RED official journal listed product specific specification. Manufacturers and test houses and notified bodies need to take great care with specification changes, as they can be considerably more complicated than initially thought, and may not, for example, just be the simple addition of receiver performance testing. Unfortunately, there's numerous examples of common pitfalls for this. Don't forget that an issued specification from a standards organisation can still potentially require further revision before publication in the RED official journal. And also don't forget that Annex 3 Notified Body Type Examination Certificate number needs to go on the manufacturer's declaration of conformity.
So unfortunately, we've run out of time for today, but we hope and we trust that you found this session interesting and relevant. So we do encourage you, if you have not already done so, to sign up for the Telecoms Essentials, which is a newsletter that we run frequently at www.TÜVSÜD.com/telecoms. So sign up for it to get the latest news, regulatory updates, and more. And if you have any questions regarding the webinar topic or what we do, just feel free to email us at telecoms@TÜVSÜD.com. Thank you for your time and have a good rest of the day ahead. So thank you, John, as well, and thank you for everyone who called in.
Okay, thank you and goodbye.